I'd like also to thank our wonderful panelists for giving up their time and expertise for this discussion of entrepreneurship and emerging technologies. I'll let them make their own introductions, but we have Alissa Ampezzan, Brenna Berman, Ryan Powell, and Stephen Collins. And Alissa, how about if I start with you, just maybe introduce yourself, your work, and then I like to ask people what the big questions on their minds are at the moment, because there may be a way that we can tease those out and tie them in to our discussion.
Yeah. Is this working? Yes.
It is.
Okay, great. Hi, thank you for having me. Like he said, my name is Alisa Ampezzan. I'm the head of design and customer experience at a company called Tempest. Has anyone heard of Tempest? I kind of thought that would be the case. Yeah. Okay, so Tempest is about a 3-year-old company. I guess you would still classify us as a startup technically. And what we're trying to do is build the largest database of cancer patients in the world and then apply emerging technology to that database in order to empower doctors and patients to benefit from all of those that came before them in their treatment. So in terms of questions, I just finished a fantastic book called Being Mortal. Atul Gawande, one of my favorite writers, especially in healthcare. And it's all about the question of end of life and what life really means. And when we're investing in futures in healthcare, oftentimes we're talking about extending life. Hopefully we're also talking about improving quality of life. But I think the questions I think about are, we're starting to be able to answer the hows of how we do that, right? But the shoulds are things that I think we have to keep in our mind. So that's a thing I've been tolling over lately.
I'm Ryan Powell, and I lead up the user experience research and design team at Waymo. Waymo is Google's self-driving technology venture, and basically my team, we are focused on the intersection of autonomy, transportation, and well, people. And so that's where we spend sort of most of our days working in that sweet spot. In terms of questions, I'll talk a little bit later about a network that we've created in Phoenix where we've launched our first commercial service. And it's a network of early riders that we gain a lot of insights from. And so top of mind for me right now is how we scale that network as we grow that program and as we move to different cities.
Great, thank you. Brenna.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Brenna Berman. I'm the CEO of a nonprofit organization based here in Chicago that focuses on solving large city problems. And the problems that hit our sweet spot are things where there's multiple players that say, yeah, that's a problem that needs to be fixed, but there really isn't anyone from a governance perspective specifically responsible for that. So you take something like flooding, for example, right? It's a problem in a number of cities, and the government is not necessarily solely responsible for that. You have nonprofit organizations who represent residents who are suffering from the outcomes of flooding. You have private sector organizations, other government entities that at different levels, and they all sit around and point at that problem and say, yeah, somebody should fix that. Well, we're that somebody that steps up and says, we're going to create the collaborative team that's going to define the solution to that problem, make sure that it works, and then scale that and bring it to market. And we work across infrastructure problems, economic development problems, human problems like homelessness, and try to develop marketable solutions so that they're sustainable. So the problem that we spend a lot of time focused on is oftentimes the technology solution, while challenging and interesting, is not that hard. It's making sure that residents have a voice in the solution that's designed, because there's always a pretty vocal set of residents that we can get engaged. It's the rest of the, say, 90% of a city that isn't particularly a squeaky wheel that we want to make sure has a perspective and a reflective voice in the design and implementation of that solution, so that we're doing really good solution development with residents and not to them.
Great.
Morning, I'm Stephen Collens. I'm the CEO of Matter. We're a healthcare technology incubator and innovation hub based in the Merchandise Mart here. Essentially, we do three things. We incubate startups. We are a community nexus. And then we work with large corporations to help them innovate more efficiently and more effectively. And our core thesis of innovation in healthcare is that you have to have entrepreneurs at the table, investors, doctors, scientists, and you have to have executives from many of the biggest companies in healthcare because of the complexity of how the healthcare industry works. It is relatively easy to solve a healthcare problem compared to being able to do that in a way that anyone's ever going to pay for it. And so our thesis is we have to have all of these different stakeholders participating and collaborating on the design and development of new solutions that can really change and improve the direction and the experience of healthcare. So one of the things that's been on our mind lately is relates to aging. And if you look at the sort of demographic trends and the percentage of people who are elderly and how that's growing, and then you look at where innovation is primarily focused, what entrepreneurs are primarily focused on, there seems to be a mismatch or a gap. There isn't as much innovation and entrepreneurship focused on the elderly as you would expect given the scale of the challenge or the magnitude of the opportunity. And so we've been digging in lately and are continuing to try to figure out why that is and what is it that we can do to spark more of an ecosystem around innovation, specifically to improve the life quality of people as they age.
Great stuff. Thank you, everyone, for your intros. I'd like to start by focusing on the opportunities, I suppose, that we're seeing with emerging technologies particularly. What sort of opportunities and what sort of changes are emerging technologies bringing to your work at the moment? Stephen, perhaps, maybe you start.
Yeah, well, so from a healthcare perspective, I think there's never been a more interesting time for innovation and technology, the ways to use technology to improve health and care. And if you look at the amount of investment that's going in, particularly to digital health solutions, it's been growing about 4 times as fast as the amount of investment going into sort of the venture capital sector overall. And the reason for that is that in addition to technology changing everything, like it's changing every industry, healthcare's really only digitized in the last 10 years with the implementation of electronic medical records. And that's creating huge opportunities to analyze data in new ways that aren't really possible if that's all stored in an analog format. And then the second thing that's happening in healthcare is that the business model's evolving. So we're sort of moving from a cost-plus based reimbursement model slowly towards one that is where payment is really tied to outcomes that are achieved and value that's created through the system. And we see a huge uptick in entrepreneurship and really an opportunity to change the way that our healthcare system works from one that today is highly episodic and highly reactive to one that is effectively an anytime, anywhere healthcare system that can really be predictive and proactive and personalized and help people manage chronic conditions and stay healthy and stay well in ways that the current architecture of the system really doesn't allow.
Great. Same to you, Ryan or Alissa, maybe?
Well, I feel like it's an easy question for me because we live and breathe self-driving technology every day, which is of course emerging technology. But then I think as we try to make that shift from personal car ownership maybe to transportation as a service, there are technologies that kind of, I think, hover around that space. So a good example would be, how do you know when a car is dirty or it needs to be cleaned, right? Since there's no human driver there and we have that car in service, what are ways that we can do that? Or what are ways that we could use machine learning to know that you've left an item in the car as you've made your way out of the car? Also, sort of day-to-day for us, we spend a lot of time trying to understand how people feel when they're in a car that's driving itself, and there are a lot of things that we do there to kind of be creative and gain some insight into what they're feeling.
I'll build on what Steven said, but kind of go a little bit deep specifically into oncology care. Yeah, we're talking about in the next, potentially less than 5 years, being able to predict the best first-line treatment for your particular type of cancer based on your individual genome and your clinical history and the actual tumor that is growing within you. So we do that through a combination of, a lot of data science techniques on imaging data, clinical data, and molecular sequencing data. And so when we combine those three things, we're able to truly see a single patient and the uniqueness of the cancer within that individual person, and hopefully get to a place, building on what he said about the payer landscape, where we're not just operating from the kind of standard of care that you get now, which is typically, generalizing of course, but chemotherapy and radiation, often surgery first, and I think surgery in a lot of cases is definitely the best first line approach. But now we're going to be able to individualize that for every patient diagnosed with this, a particular type of cancer. We know now, and I'm sure many know this, if you have anyone in your family who's been diagnosed, that cancer is not one disease, it's hundreds of diseases, and it's based on your individual genome. And only have we been able to unpack, obviously, the genome, and then with the combination of the fact that cloud computing is so cheap, combined with molecular sequencing costs going down, and then Tempest making the significant investment in structuring all clinical data of patients, are we going to be able to use all of that to build the predictions of what, God forbid, I was diagnosed tomorrow? I don't have to be looking into an abyss, but rather be thinking about, frankly, a decision tree that hopefully is something grounded in empirical evidence.
So cities are perhaps the most complex systems that you can be looking at anywhere, and are going to be undergoing a series of changes in the next 20 to 30 years, unlike we've probably ever seen, because of population growth, driven by things like desire for economic growth, right? It's where the jobs are, it's where the ingenuity is, and drivers like climate change. So as sea levels rise, people will be moving from, well, depending on where you are in the globe, the south and the north to the other side. And I think most people probably know the fact that by 2030, right, for the first time in human history, more people will be living in cities than anywhere else in the world. Which presents both challenges and opportunities. So the trends that my fellow panelists just pointed out from the areas where they work will all be playing out in the various lines of business that make up cities. So the personalization of medicine, which is absolutely incredible for its applications to things like cancer research and other diseases, can also be applied to the services and things that people are taking advantages of cities. So the personalization of education, right? Right now, all of our children actually get just about the same type of education, which makes absolutely no sense because kids are different. So now, your precious little kid can actually have a personalized education plan. You need to start thinking about equity because that will be available first to the 1%, and you want to make sure it's available to 100% of kids. So all of these fabulous benefits that technology make available also will beg the question of how do we make sure they're available to all so that the diversity gap doesn't become worse. So cities are going to become sort of the playground where we really are going to have to think about the disparity gaps that technology highlights, right? How we address those. And I think what's going to be most interesting is cities are going to begin to differentiate themselves on the technologies that they bring to bear on the sort of happiness and healthy factors of those cities. So now you choose to live in the city that sort of addresses the kind of culture that you want in your life or that you want for your family, right? Do you want to be in a big, dense, busy New York type city where you can get any kind of food at any hour of the day? Or do you want to live in a smaller, quieter, kind of Akron sort of city, right? People make those decisions on the kind of life that they want to have. And technologies are going to begin to be one of those differentiators that cities develop their value proposition on. Because cities do that, right? They are making a pitch to you. Like, now lots of people grow up and live in the same city they were born in and perhaps do not realize they are making that choice, but we're a much more mobile society today, right? And people are choosing to live in the place that they think is going to provide them the best opportunity for, job growth, for economic growth, for the type of life they want to provide for themselves, their family, the next generation. And technology is going to become a part of that. And you already see this playing out in countries like China and the Middle East, where they are building cities where technology is a key part of the value proposition to bring people in those cities. And there have been interesting sort of failures around some of this where they're realizing that technology isn't necessarily driving the cultural aspects that attract cities. So in a city that was built in South Korea, where they realize that people are attracted by things like music and nightlife and those aspects of your life that add color and enjoyment. Technology doesn't make a blues band or a blues club pop up, right? It's other cultural things that make that happen. And people like to have those things in their lives, and they couldn't make a nightlife show up in this city until they realized they could incentivize that with economic aspects. So they're now doing that because that's what makes people want to live in cities. So you're going to see economic development driven by technological aspects and challenges around the have and have not aspects. So you're going to see technology and emerging technologies drive where people live and how they live, and the very real challenge of what's available to the have and have nots in our world.
Great. I really like what you said to all the staff that answer about the complexity of cities, that they are among the most complex systems going. And of course, one thing we know is that when we have emerging technologies, they themselves have complex effects on complex systems such as cities. So we need to find ways to make sense of that impact, to try and figure out the best way to respond and to deploy resources effectively. So this perhaps is where this idea of entrepreneurship might come in. Does entrepreneurial thinking, does that offer us a way to help consider those very complex interactions between these complex systems and these complex technologies? Is that something that we're finding a valuable way to sort out some of those tricky challenges?
Well, I have the microphone, but I don't know if I have a great answer. I'd say that, when I think of entrepreneurial thinking, it does, we spend a lot of our time trying to think more about, or ask the question, instead of why, more why not. And so I think in terms of entrepreneurial thinking in my day-to-day, a lot of it involves trying to reframe maybe a traditional problem and where it's been solved in a certain way to think about that a little bit differently. And also experimentation or taking risk, I guess, is a big thing for us as well. And so we're very measured, I guess, I'd say, in terms of getting something out there very quickly, seeing how people, what their behaviors are and how that incorporates into their day-to-day lives, and then making a change very quickly and going through that rapid iteration cycle. So those are some, I guess, maybe some of the qualities or attributes of an entrepreneurial mindset that we would sort of factor into my day-to-day.
I'll build on that. I think that one of the things about complexity is that it's really intimidating. You look at the problem and you just stand in awe of it for a really long time and kind of worship how hard it's going to be to do it. And one of the things I love about Tempus in particular is that we don't think we're solving this in 6 months or in 2 years or frankly in probably 5 to 10 years. We're lucky enough to have the support, leadership, and capital to think that way. But what we have done is said, yes, here's the vision of the thing we're trying to do, and I hopefully articulated that to you, but that means that every day you gotta show up and you gotta be okay with the fact that this day is going to be really hard and you're probably not going to make super exceptional progress against that huge vision. But then you zoom out and 4 months later you come into work and you're like, oh, that problem that was a big problem 4 months ago is not as big as it was. And you have that luxury of perspective. And part of that is just, it's the old adage of like entrepreneurs bring together people from different perspectives with different expertise, with appetite for risk, with, all of those things. But it's true. You put all those people in a building and you say, I'm going to pay you a salary for a while, and eventually they start, and I think we're going to get into this later in terms of kind of bringing together disparate stakeholders. When I'm talking about, I spend most of my day with a pathologist, not with an engineer, and just forcing me and her to sit in a room every day and talk it through and balance each other's perspectives, and that's a small piece of the broader picture. Investing in that for the long term, I think, is an entrepreneurial way of thinking, and being okay with adapting. So like you were saying, you're iterating every day, and you kind of got to create the space for that, rather than here's the business plan of 5 years from now, or frankly 10 years from now, and everyone going, never going to happen. It's just never going to happen.
Right, thank you. Coming back to something you mentioned there about, yes, entrepreneurs bringing people together. This is very much one of the themes we're trying to explore over the course of this day or two, is how we activate those networks, how we bring these disparate groups of individuals together and pool their skills for the greater good. Dennis, in the intro, talked about this idea of distributed agency, of solutions being essentially needing the consultation and input across a very wide set of people. I think, at the risk of editorializing, sometimes we've had in the tech industry maybe a bit of a technocratic approach, where we've seen technology as the solution to all of society's ills. How do we avoid that kind of risk of technocratic overreach? How do we actually try and more appropriately engage democratic function and a diverse set of individuals, rather than just foisting technological solutions upon, for example, cities?
And I think for us, it's you start with the problem first, and then you start to delve into that problem with the people who are living it first. The solution comes second. So we actually don't start with, we've got a great hammer, whether that's, a widget, a sensor, a whatever. We start with what's the most pressing problem that the city government or the community or the construction company is dealing with. And they have one perspective on that problem, and then you need to blow out that perspective to the myriad of other parties that are dealing with the other aspect of that. Is kind of a cube view of who's dealing with it. So you start with the problem and the number of players that are dealing with that problem. And then you start to think about the solution, which actually may or may not be a technology solution, right? It might actually be a model or a governance or something else that is actually the best answer. It's not always technology either. That's the best answer to it.
Sure. Stephen, anything on that?
Yeah, I think there's two things that you talked about or hinted on. One is, how do you keep the technology from driving the process as opposed to the problem driving the process? And the second one is related to collaboration, and how do you kind of bring these multi-parties together? And I think if done right, they're related, and maybe the second one solves the first one? I can't remember the order. First one of them solves the other one. So our thesis, again, in healthcare is that you have to have entrepreneurs at the table. They have an ability to take risks, to move very quickly, to iterate rapidly in response to feedback from the market in ways that large companies are often almost entirely very challenged to do. But you also need big companies, you need hospitals, you need patients, you need doctors, you need all these different people at the table from the very beginning of understanding, kind of similar to what Brenna was saying, what is the problem that we're trying to solve here? And then what's the right approach to solve it? And then we're going to create something, and we need to test it quickly, because if we don't, we're likely to kind of keep meandering down a path and ultimately end up with something that looks fantastic and nobody's ever going to buy. And so we're constantly trying to inject more kind of multi-stakeholder perspective at every point in that process, from the ideation all the way through to kind of going to market and scaling up ideas.
Okay. One thing I like about this panel, one thing that excited me, was seeing the diversity of domains that are represented here. You know, we have autonomous transport, we have healthcare and biotech, we have smart cities, IoT, etc. But underpinning pretty much every emerging technology now is a reliance on data and some kind of artificial intelligence, a loosely defined term, but some kind of machine learning or some at least leveraging of learning systems using that data in some sort of intelligent way. Clearly that has a lot of potential. Data and machine learning and AI offer significant upsides, but they also potentially come at a cost. They could be misused or used in ways that are opaque to end users, that reduce agency, that reduce people's understanding of how these systems are assembled and how they work around them. So how do we as technologists and designers try to draw that line between the power of these systems while also trying to give people agency, give them control and intelligibility of the things we build?
I mean, I think this is why we're having this conversation at a design school. I really think, part of building on what Steven said about, it's not just tech versus, I think design is very much that little plus sign between those things, because we're not quite fully on the software engineering side or data science side, and we're not quite fully on the stakeholder end user side, or whatever you want to call it. We are the translational device of those, between those things. And so, my answer to that, you asked, you gave us a preview of that question. I've thought about that one probably the most. And I'm not sure we're ready to fully ignore it. I'm not ready to ignore the transparency we have to have on what these algorithms are doing and how we're using them. We are not at the stage yet of the power being so black box and trustworthy that we can just say, yep, that's working. We have to have a relationship with the humans involved. And so much of what human-centered design is for us to understand that and meet them where they are and bring them along on that journey. So one of my favorite examples is, and I'll touch on this. I have a follow-up panel about how I was sold on this big vision of what Tempest is trying to do, which is a highly technical, cutting-edge solution. And one of the first design projects I had to do when I came on board was to redesign the paper report that we send to the doctors. It is faxed, it is scanned, it is uploaded into EMRs. I was going back 15 years into graphic design mode again, and I realized that's what it means to them at the point of care. All the data that happens behind the scenes, all the computational power ends up on a single sheet of paper that says you have these 5 mutations and there are these targeted therapies available to your patient right now. And that translation is so important, and that point of accessibility and meeting them so that we can bring them all along on this journey of trust that I think we're all kind of hopeful, whether it be the people, passengers in cars, or a patient, or in our case it's mostly doctors, to be clear, that they if they're going to trust that end vision, they got to trust the day-to-day touch points of what we're showing them. And I think we have to be as transparent as we possibly can in these kind of early days of what all of this is.
Right. Yeah, just to add to that from healthcare perspective, our view of the world is not that doctors are going to go away and that hospitals are going to go away, or and you hear that. I hear that from, especially coming out of Silicon Valley. There's companies that pop up and they're like, we're going to replace the doctors and we're not going to need them anymore and blah, blah. It's not our view of the world. Our view of the world is, maybe we're a century away from that, but that's not what's happening, and that's not how technology is being used in the foreseeable future. I'll give you an example of how it is being used that is incredibly additive to the human interactions and human the dimension of healthcare today. There's a company that was developed by a cardiologist at the University of Chicago who for 10 or 12 years was studying kind of all the reasons why people decompensate or kind of get, they crash, they get a lot worse when they're in an inpatient in a hospital setting. And as the technology of the hospital at Chicago where she was working evolved and developed, as their electronic medical record system got more sophisticated, as there were more and more data points that were sort of available inside of the EMR, she built her algorithm and took all of her research and it got more and more sophisticated over time until now she's got 30 or 40 different data points that kind of flow into it, many of that in real time. Her system was implemented at a hospital in the western suburbs, and they were using it on the obstetrics ward. And there was a woman there who was ready to deliver, and this system kept flagging her as someone who was in serious trouble and was, essentially she was on the verge of crashing and she was going to have to go to the ICU, and that's what this system looks for and picks up. And so the team would go and they'd look at her and they'd ask her, and she'd like, I feel fine, and they'd poke her and look at her, and everything felt fine. And then the system kept flagging her over and over a period of however many hours. They finally got everyone together and they said, we don't have a pulse oximeter on her. It's not part of our normal process. Why don't we just throw that on and see what happens? And her blood oxygen level was effectively 0, which means that the baby was about to die and she was about to end up in the ICU. And they said, oh shit. And they intervened, they solved it, she's fine, the baby's fine. And they never would have known. She felt fine. The human interactions seemed totally normal, but the system had a different level of kind of processing and a different capability that was highly additive to the healthcare experience. And that's where we see for the foreseeable future this huge innovation being able to help keep people healthier and avoid kind of really negative situations that can come up.
So and I think both of you have made excellent points around sort of keeping the human in mind and the plus around design, and why I actually think design around injecting data into human processes is so important, and why it's actually specifically important in cities or where you're injecting advanced technologies that leverage data or data collection in the public way. Because in the work you're doing, someone could actually opt out if they wanted to. I think they would be crazy to, but they could opt out and say, I don't want to participate. When you're implementing technology in the city, as a resident, you can't opt out. So the best example is all of the crazy technologies that like Disney World is using. When you go to Disney World, there's like insane technology at play in Disney World, but you could not go to Disney World, right? If you don't want to be tracked and monitored the way that you are there, you could not go. The same technologies can all be brought to bear in Times Square for the same benefits, except as a New Yorker, and yes, you could, I guess, walk around Times Square, but those are public streets, right? As a New Yorker, you cannot opt out of walking through Times Square if, like, your house is, your apartment is like half a block off of Times Square. You can't not go to Times Square. You can't opt out of your city streets, right? You can't, and most people don't have the economic means to move out of New York City and move to Boston instead, right? That's an incredibly expensive endeavor for most residents. So when you're talking about technology in the public way and you're thinking about how to properly design that implementation or design a prototype for a data-driven technology in the public way, residents can't opt out. And this is actually one of the design challenges we've faced here in Chicago, that Boston, Seattle, San Francisco are taking on now, is how do you properly educate, engage, talk with residents about like the purpose and the value and the privacy policies and security protocols for these technologies when they can't say, hey, I'm not comfortable, I don't want to participate, because they can't do that. So that's a really interesting sort of design challenge around, and I think that this is actually probably part of your work too, because you can't, like, as these vehicles show up, they're going to be how vehicles are, and you can't opt out from mobility either. So it's a really interesting concept around data design in the public way.
Does that, by extension then, if you can't opt out of these systems, does that mean that a smart city is a surveillance city?
It kind of depends on some of the rules. So San Francisco's made some decisions where they don't want that to be the case. So you can't install public cameras in San Francisco. They just passed an ordinance the other day, which, depending on how you feel about it, where you cannot, the city will not allow the implementation of facial recognition in the public way. Now, you can't have cameras in San Francisco, so I don't know how they were doing facial recognition anyway, so there's interesting things about the ordinance. So there are some cities that are trying to prevent that, but also one on the flip side is, how do you ensure physical safety without surveillance? Right? So you could go the way that, frankly, that London has, right, which is the most cameraed city in the world, but there's actually really clear privacy policies all over the city that you read walking into every restaurant, every building, right? The city's privacy policy is very clearly stated. So there's different cities have taken different approaches to manage these technologies that are deeply cultural, right? So what San Francisco is doing, which is very specific to how people that live there feel about that and is translated into their representation. And frankly, if you talk to New Yorkers, most New Yorkers they think that's silly. Like things like that are deployed in New York all the time, with New Yorkers not noticing, not caring. It doesn't make the papers. And frankly, Chicago's somewhere in the middle, to be honest. And then Seattle is a completely different kettle of fish because, frankly, they have the most highly educated, like technologically savvy residents in Seattle because of the companies that live there. So what their government has to go through to do anything is entirely different. So it's deeply cultural.
Right. I mean, I think you are absolutely right that culture matters a lot. At present, at least for the time being, I am from the EU. Where we do have very significantly different data protection regimes and cultural expectations of privacy. Ryan, I'd be interested actually in your take on this, because of course some of the technologies, the machines that you build, have LiDAR and all sorts of sensors which map out an environment, but also then could capture large amounts of the city around us. How do you deal with the challenges, privacy and cultural expectations that introduces?
Well, I'd say that we are in the early days, so we do have principles that are guiding us at the moment, and so we very much want to be transparent. We want to have sort of a best-in-class approach to how we think about privacy. So if you think about Google Maps and the way that it goes around in Street View, right, it'll capture data, and if you've ever looked at Street View, you notice that they blur faces out of people. And there is a way that you can go in and you can say, hey, I don't want I'm in this image and I want to be taken out of it. And so we're following. We're fortunate in the sense that we've been able to learn from those those products and services, and we want to adopt some of those best practices as well. But we're still trying to figure it out. I mean, when you get into a car, if you are the person who didn't hail the car, if you step back for a second, if I hail a self-driving car, what we try to do at least in our user experience, is be very transparent and have you opt in, and so that you know what kind of a value exchange that you have between Waymo and yourself in terms of the data that you are going to give us, and then the user experience that we're going to in return try to provide to you. But if you're a guest of somebody and you're riding along in that car, then what does it mean for that person? So that's the level, now what we're trying to try to work through. In the cars, there's a camera, and so you are being recorded when you take a ride, and there are a lot of good reasons why that needs to happen. It's a safety reason. So if somebody's having a medical emergency, we can see that in the vehicle. The examples I mentioned earlier in terms of just leaving something behind or knowing when the car is dirty, we are able to pick those things up. The more and more images that, when we think about machine learning, we're able to flag those moments when we have that camera that's in the car. So as a designer, I kind of always go back to this idea of a value exchange, and to make sure that if somebody is giving something to us, that they are getting something in return, and that we are being upfront and honest about that.
Sure. Okay. I'd like just to come back to something you mentioned earlier as well, and put it in a broader context for the rest of the panel. You talked about the importance for Waymo of early iteration, of getting things out with real users and seeing how that's working and how we need to adapt our approaches and then iterating rapidly within that. And I'd say that's fairly common across the tech sector. That's pretty much now sort of default practice, I think, for the tech community, this idea of lean startup and build, measure, learn and all that sort of stuff. But what really interests me is when that mentality collides with medicine, and medicine has quite a different approach and often ethically quite a different approach as well. Medicine is usually highly precautionary. It's often predicated upon the idea of avoiding harm at any cost. So those two philosophies potentially collide and they don't seem to blend particularly well. How do you negotiate that gap between those perspectives, and also what can those perspectives learn from each other perhaps? Maybe Stephen.
Well, that's a big problem. Because you don't really want your hospital to be on the cutting edge of everything. You don't want your doctor to be sort of testing and experimenting with things all the time. You want your doctor to have done the same thing 3,000 times before he or she is doing something to you, not being like, this looks cool, why don't I try this and see how it works? And so one of the challenges that entrepreneurs have in healthcare when they're working on things with clinical implications is collecting enough data to really demonstrate the value and inspire enough confidence that healthcare practitioners are going to be comfortable ultimately implementing solutions. So there's a couple of kind of general things. So the example I gave of the company a minute ago, they provide a sort of extra layer of information to healthcare professionals that healthcare professionals can then take, and they have to figure out what to do with it and how to adapt that into their system of understanding of how sort of patients, of what's going on with a particular patient. And there's a lot of that that we see. Then the other one is you got to carve out little safe spaces to be able to test things, because there's lots of ways that we think and that technology can improve health and improve care, but you got to validate it and you have to test it. And so we're always trying to work with entrepreneurs to sort of get them into situations where they can test things, where they can pilot things, where there's a safe space to do that, where they're not creating additional risk. But it's a huge challenge in healthcare, because there's a tension that you kind of want. Like you don't want a bunch of crazy, cowboy stuff happening. But you sort of need to create the spaces to be able to innovate.
Sure. Alissa, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's literally the premise of Tempest is exploiting the tension between those of us who don't come from a traditional healthcare background, putting them in the same room as pathologists, oncologists, laboratory technicians, nurses, clinical administrators, et cetera. We talk about it all the time. One of the things that I talk about within my team at Tempest and the role of design, I'm going off a little bit on a tangent, but hopefully I'll pull it back, is that we're not just designing products, we're designing the people interactions within the organization that has never been done before. And that's actually the innovation, is to bring these disparate perspectives together in a place to solve, hopefully, this problem. And so when I say that, I mean, I cannot tell you how many times our conversations about product end up in screaming. Emotions run high. And one of the things that designers tend to do, because of empathy and general personality and whatever, I think, is that we try to make both in our case, it's not just two-sided, it's kind of a multi-sided system of stakeholders recognize that the reason we're getting impassioned and kind of digging our heels into our perspective or our opinion is because we care about this problem, and we're all coming at it because we care. But when you have 15 years of design theory training and they have 25 years of medical laboratory training and 30 years of sitting in front of a patient and telling them you don't have another option here, you have very different worldviews of risk tolerance, of how solutions come about, the practicality of a solution in a regulatory environment, et cetera. And so I think that I totally agree with everything Stephen said. We have a similar setup in that we definitely have established our kind of core group of physicians, frankly, mostly in the Chicago area, our early adopter people that we can test new ideas with. The design team is a huge part of that in the sense that we leverage InDesign and Framer prototypes to the nth degree of just testing concepts before we start building things. And again, testing the risk tolerance through a screen is an incredible thing, a screen that you can mock up in 40 minutes and have the conversation. It's not the thing you're building. I guarantee you it's not the thing you're building, but it's the artifact that allows you to have the conversation and the negotiation around what could work. And so design definitely plays that role of kind of testing and stuff. But one of the other things I wanted to touch on is that I do think, we have a laboratory, it's CAP CLIA certified, we're HIPAA certified. You just end up kind of having to live in this highly regulated environment. But still within it, even the FDA is changing the way they're thinking about software approvals, or I guess they call them medical devices, even if it's software, but where they're starting to give these broader approvals that allow for more iteration, where they say, okay, company, you've proved to us that your first iteration of this software is pretty damn good and passes our standards and blah, blah, blah. We're going to keep a real close eye on you, but we don't need to approve every release because tech needs to release software in that way, right? Mm-hmm. And so even you see that these regulating bodies, the payers, et cetera, are just slapped in the face with this revolution and are trying to adapt. But at the same time, again, what Stephen said, the data, anytime you're collecting the data, the whole premise of what we're doing is we can say to a doctor, sure, you've treated 400 other patients like this at University of Chicago in the last 10 years. And what we're saying is there are 40,000 patients like that across the world. And let's show you how all pancreatic oncologists, let's say, have used a third-line therapy after first-line carboplatin and radiation or something like that. And so it's just exacerbating the problem they're already trying to solve, which is, you want them to say, I've done this 1,000 times before. What if they can say, I've done this 1,000 times, and also I've seen what 100,000 other people have done.
Right. So we're running a very long time, so I think we'll just have one final question to wrap up. And I think what unifies a lot of the work we're doing is really that we are exploring and creating futures. I see us as that's part of our role is to is the exposition and creation of those possible futures. But thinking about the future of our respective fields, is there anything that worries you? Or what are the questions that we need to be asking about those futures that we currently aren't?
I guess I'll just bring it back to my first thing. What does it mean to extend life? Is that the sole goal of healthcare? I shouldn't say healthcare, medicine. And as we run, not walk towards artificial intelligence in medicine, are we pausing appropriately on the human element within every single person who's diagnosed with cancer and their decision based on their age, family, circumstance about what treatment is right for them? Because what we're doing at Tempest, hopefully, is giving people a much better set of options much earlier in their disease. And yet, we still have this enormous burden of informing not only the patients, but the physicians of the implications of those decisions.
Okay. Ryan, any unanswered questions or unasked questions that are bugging you?
Yeah, I mean, well, what I would say is that because we're in such an early day of how autonomous vehicles will have an effect on cities and other environments, there are a lot of unknowns, and we have more questions than we do answers, and those effects are very hard to forecast or to predict, and so I know that at least my colleagues back at Waymo, we very much have the best intentions, and we want to be able to navigate those effects and end up on the good side of a solution. But there are just still a lot of unknowns. Like Robin Chase writes a lot about autonomous vehicles and how they could affect cities. And when you begin to think about all the various areas that will be affected, it is a very broad surface area, and I think it's just we're in that very early days, and I think it'll just be a little bit of trying something out, seeing what effect happens, and making adjustments from there. But it is something that's very hard to plan for, and that does it's certainly a big unknown.
Sure. Stephen, Brenna, any quick final thoughts from you on that question?
I think the biggest opportunity and risk that we face going forward that no one has an answer to yet is around who owns all of the data. The largest sort of source of that data in the future is going to be data coming from our very persons, right? And I think a lot of us hear the line that like data is the new oil. I actually think that's wrong. I think it's much more akin to oxygen. And that could actually very well end up in the hands of individual large corporations, and it is unclear what the ownership frameworks are around that and who's protecting the data of individuals who don't quite understand its value.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Stephen?
The way that we pay for healthcare, the way that our healthcare system kind of operates as a hindrance to the development and the use of a lot of technology that we already know can really improve health and care, and the ability of technology to, again, improve health and improve health care is going up fairly significantly, and there's this huge impediment of how the whole system is structured. So if you want to worry, it's that that system is not evolving fast enough to create the construct to allow all these technologies that can really improve health and improve healthcare to really take root as fast as they ought to.
Great stuff. Thank you. I think we need to leave it there. I'd like to thank you all. Thanks, Alissa, Brenna, Ryan, and Stephen for your insight. And obviously, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thanks a lot.